Daniel sat alone on the last wooden bench of the old church, his hands resting heavily in his lap. The evening sun shone through the stained glass windows, filling the empty room with beautiful colors. But Daniel could see nothing beautiful anymore. His eyes were tired, his heart was broken, and his soul felt empty. For years, he had carried one loss after another, and now he felt as though life had taken everything from him. He looked toward the large cross above the altar and wondered if God was still listening. He had prayed so many times before. He had prayed for his family, his wife, his son, and his future. But every prayer seemed to disappear into silence. Tonight, Daniel had come to the church because he had nowhere else to go. Slowly, Daniel clasped his trembling hands together and lowered his head. "God," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I don't know how to pray anymore." Tears rolled down his face. He felt ashamed of his anger and doubt, but he was too exhausted to hide them. "I have tried to stay strong. I have tried to believe that you have a plan, but I can't do this anymore. I have nothing left." The church remained completely silent. Daniel took a deep breath and looked toward the cross one more time. "If you are still there," he whispered, "please give me one reason not to give up." It was not a beautiful prayer. It was not filled with perfect words. It was simply the cry of a broken man who had reached the end of his strength.
There was a time when Daniel could never have imagined feeling so alone. His home had once been full of life. His wife, Sarah, had a warm laugh that could fill every room. And his son Michael had always found a way to make ordinary days feel special. They ate dinner together, celebrated birthdays, and spent quiet evenings talking about their dreams. Daniel remembered Sarah standing in the kitchen, smiling as she prepared dinner, while Michael teased her about her cooking. Daniel would sit at the table and watch them, believing that happiness like this would last forever. But life does not always warn us before it changes. Sometimes the people we love are beside us one day, and the next day we are learning how to live without them. Sarah became ill slowly. At first, Daniel believed she would recover. He took her to doctors, held her hand during appointments, and promised her that everything would be all right. But as the months passed, hope became harder to hold on to. Daniel spent long nights beside her hospital bed, listening to the quiet sounds of machines and watching the woman he loved grow weaker. Every night, he prayed, "Please heal her," he begged. "Please don't take her away from me." Sarah would sometimes open her tired eyes and smile at him. "Daniel," she whispered one night, "whatever happens, don't let your heart become bitter." He promised her he wouldn't, but after Sarah died, Daniel discovered that promises made before grief are sometimes difficult to keep.
Sarah's death left a silence inside the house that Daniel could not escape. Her empty chair at the dinner table felt like a wound that never stopped hurting. Michael was grieving too, but Daniel could not see past his own pain. One evening, their sadness finally turned into anger. "You don't understand what I'm going through," Daniel shouted. Michael stared at him with tears in his eyes. "Mom wasn't only yours, Dad. I lost her too." Those words should have brought them closer together. Instead, Daniel turned away. Neither of them knew how to comfort the other. They were two broken people standing in the same house. Separated by grief they did not know how to share.
A few weeks later, Michael stood at the front door with a suitcase beside him. Daniel watched from the living room, his heart pounding. He wanted to tell his son not to leave. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to say that he loved him. But grief had made Daniel silent. Michael looked back at him one last time. For a brief moment, Daniel thought his son was waiting for him to say something. But Daniel said nothing. Michael opened the door and walked away. The sound of the closing door stayed in Daniel's mind for years. He told himself that Michael would come back someday. Then months passed. Months became years. Phone calls became shorter, and eventually there was only silence. Daniel had already lost his wife. Now he had lost his son too. Life continued, but Daniel no longer felt that he was truly living. His small business began to fail. Bills piled up on the kitchen table. He worked harder, but nothing seemed to improve. Every problem felt heavier because he had no one to share it with. The house became quieter with every passing year. Sometimes Daniel would hear a sound from another room and, for one hopeful second, think Sarah was there. Sometimes he would see a young man walking down the street and think of Michael. On birthdays and holidays, Daniel would pick up the phone and stare at his son's number. Sometimes he called. Sometimes Michael answered. Most of the time, neither knew what to say. Eventually, Daniel stopped calling. He convinced himself that Michael no longer needed him. But deep inside, he missed his son every single day. One cold morning, Daniel found a letter waiting in his mailbox. He opened it at the kitchen table. It was the final notice from the bank. His hands began to shake. He had 2 weeks to leave his home. Daniel looked around the room slowly. Every corner held a memory. Sarah had painted the kitchen walls herself. Michael had scratched his name into the wooden door frame when he was a child. How could he leave all of it behind? That afternoon, Daniel walked through the house, touching familiar objects, as if saying, "Goodbye to old friends." He stood in Sarah's room and closed his eyes. "I don't know what to do anymore," he whispered. As evening came, he put on his coat and walked toward the one place where he had once believed he could find peace, the church. Daniel sat beneath the stained glass windows and gave God his last prayer. Afterward, he waited. 1 minute passed. Then another. Nothing happened. No voice spoke to him. No miracle appeared. The church remained as quiet as before. Daniel felt a familiar disappointment rise inside him. Perhaps this was the truth, he thought. Perhaps he had been talking to silence all these years. Slowly, he stood from the bench. His heart felt heavier than when he had entered. He began walking toward the church door, believing that even his final prayer had received no answer. Then he heard a gentle voice behind him. "Daniel?" He stopped. Daniel turned around. An elderly woman from the church stood near the front pews. In her hands was an old envelope. "I think this belongs to you," she said softly. Daniel walked toward her and looked at the envelope. His name was written across the front. Then he noticed the handwriting. His heart stopped. He knew those letters. He had seen them on birthday cards, grocery lists, and little notes Sarah used to leave for him on the kitchen table. His fingers trembled as he took the envelope. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In the old prayer box," the woman replied. "It must have been hidden there for years." Daniel could barely breathe. Sarah had been gone for so long, yet somehow her words had found their way back to him on the night he had made his last prayer. Daniel slowly opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was old, but Sarah's handwriting was clear. As he read, tears filled his eyes. Sarah wrote about love, faith, and the difficult days she knew might come. She asked Daniel not to allow pain to close his heart. She reminded him that grief could make people push away those who needed them most. Then he read the words that broke him completely. She had written about Michael. She asked Daniel to always keep the door open for their son, even if life ever took them in different directions. Love sometimes waits, she had written. Sometimes it forgives, and sometimes it simply refuses to believe that goodbye is forever. Daniel pressed the letter against his chest and began to cry. For years, he had believed everything was lost. But Sarah's words reminded him that perhaps some things were only waiting to be found again. Daniel stayed in the church for a long time. The same room that had felt empty only minutes earlier now felt different. His problems had not disappeared. Sarah was still gone. His home was still in danger. His business was still lost. But something inside him had changed. For the first time in years, Daniel realized that an answer did not always mean life becoming easy. Sometimes, an answer simply gave you the courage to take the next step. He looked again at Sarah's letter. Then he thought of Michael. How many times had he waited for his son to call first? How many years had passed because both of them were waiting for the other to break the silence? Daniel suddenly understood what he needed to do. He left the church with the letter in his pocket and hope slowly returning to his heart. That night, Daniel sat beneath an old family photograph. Sarah smiled from the picture. Michael stood beside her, younger and carefree. Daniel picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over Michael's number for several minutes. Then he pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice. Daniel almost ended the call. Then he heard a voice. "Hello?" Daniel closed his eyes. Michael. Silence filled the space between them. Finally, Daniel whispered, "I'm sorry." The words came slowly at first, then all at once. He apologized for his anger, his silence, and every year he had allowed pride to keep him from his son. On the other end, Michael began to cry. Then he said something Daniel never expected. "Dad, I was thinking about calling you too." A few days later, Daniel and Michael returned to the church together. Daniel sat beside his son and looked toward the cross. He thought about the night he had come there believing he had nothing left. He had expected God to remove his problems. He had wanted a miracle that would bring Sarah back, save his home, and erase his pain. But that was not the answer he received. Instead, God had given him something unexpected. A forgotten letter, the courage to make a phone call, and the chance to hold his son again. Daniel smiled through his tears as Michael sat beside him. He finally understood that sometimes God's answers do not arrive with thunder or miracles. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through a door that opens, a voice that answers, or a person who comes back when you thought they were gone forever. Daniel had entered the church with one last prayer, but he left with something far greater than he had asked for. He left with hope, and for the first time in many years, he believed that his story was not ending. Perhaps, after all, the pain and silence, God was simply beginning a new chapter.